Welcome to another edition of Drugs, Crime, and Politics, brought to you by the Drug Policy Forum of Texas. Good evening. I'm your host, Buford Terrell. With me tonight, my colleague Clayton Jones.
Good evening.
And we've been having Clayton zooming around the country lately. He attended the Drug Policy Forum's big meeting in Albuquerque, and he attended the symposium on drug trafficking here at the Baker Institute in Houston just recently. So we'll be getting his comments tonight and have some film clips from the Baker Institute that we can talk about. I think probably the first order of business tonight, though, is that there was a very interesting story in this morning's Houston Chronicle. The district attorney, Pat Lycos, has announced that her office will no longer be filing criminal cases in drug possession felonies involving less than 1/100th of a gram. And that includes all of the illegal drugs, including cocaine, amphetamines, heroin. Just to kind of orient you about what we mean by 1/100th of a gram. If you go to a restaurant and pick up one of those little packages of sugar or sweetener, those contain about a gram. If you take a small grain of uncooked rice and cut it in two, that half a grain of uncooked rice is about 1/100th of a gram. So this is the level that she's talking about.
Most other counties, not towns, go by 2 100ths. We're half of whatever all the others are.
Yeah, and part of the reason for this, which is an improvement really, part of the reason is that with 1/100th of a gram, there's barely enough to run a chemical test to identify what the substance really is. And normally the law allows the defense to also test the substance to double check and to have its own test to see if it's accurate. And with 1/100th of a gram, there's not enough of the substance to do two independent tests. So that's the main reason why I think that she chose the 100th of a gram level. She also said that in the case of drug paraphernalia, for instance, a crack pipe, she would no longer file a drug possession case based on the residue within that pipe, and instead would suggest that the policeman write citations, which are the same as a traffic ticket. The drug paraphernalia charge would be a Class C misdemeanor with a maximum $500 fine. Now, that's what the state law on drug paraphernalia is, but what has happened in cities like Houston, by using the residue within the pipe, which would test positive for the drug, the police could boost it up into a felony drug possession case. Mm-hmm. Now, these small amount drug possessions are 2-year state jail felonies. But there's a lot of them. They said that of the roughly 46,000 felony arrests or cases filed in Harris County last year, 13,700, or about 30% of them, were these low-level drug possession cases. The sheriff said that it's rather unclear from his records, but that probably about 750 jail inmates out of the 11,000 or so currently in jail would be affected by this policy. So I think that DA Lycos deserves a big pat on the back for this. It's a big step forward.
Yes. Now, the program before ours is Commissioner
Constable Trevino.
Constable Trevino. He was telling me that last week he got the memo on this. And he also said that she was going to do citations up to 2 ounces, and that was going to start on January 10th.
That you mean for marijuana, don't you?
Yes, simple possession.
Simple possession of marijuana, not of the harder drugs.
Right.
My guess is that he's probably misunderstanding that, Clayton, in that the state law was passed 2 years ago,
Yes.
which allows cities and counties to opt for that procedure. But a district attorney has no authority to order it on her own hook. It requires action by the governing body, which would be the city council or the commissioner's court. And then at their request, it would require the administrative judge for the judicial district. In Harris County, that would be all of the district judges, to propose and put together a plan about when citations should be used, how they should be written, how the return date to come into court would be administered. And until this is done, then there is no authority for the police to use citations on misdemeanor possessions. Now, what may have happened when that law was passed nearly 3 years ago now, our district attorney at the time said basically, over my dead body, any cases where their citation is given instead of arrest, I refuse to prosecute them. Now, what she may have simply done is said, I'm now prepared to prosecute cases that are started with citation. But it's still going to require action on the part of the city council and the commissioner's court and the administrative court of the judges before it can be put into effect.
How do we find out when this is all being done? Is this something that the public can witness?
It would have to be an agenda item for both the city council and the commissioner's court, which means that it would have to be made public, and their meetings are all open to the public and you can attend. And if they haven't done anything, city council in Houston at least has an open mic system.
Yes.
Every Tuesday afternoon for their 2 o'clock meeting. If you sign up, and you can do it by telephone 30 minutes in advance. You can speak to the city council for 3 minutes on anything that suits your fancy. And this would certainly be something well worth telling the city council about. Let's remind you that this is your show. We welcome your telephone calls. We'll take your comments or questions. If you are watching over streaming video or on a delayed basis through YouTube, we also post an email address so that you can email me. I'll respond to you, and it may be that we will include your question or comment on our next broadcast. But we certainly want to hear from you. We want your input to the show. We try to take your questions as a little bit of a guidance about where your interests lay and where we should follow on this. Let's talk a little bit about your travels lately.
Well, I drove out to New Orleans, to New Mexico, to Albuquerque.
Okay.
And the conference was well over 1,000 people.
Yeah.
Way, way over. I don't know exactly how many, but that hall was full.
Yeah.
The classes that they had, every single one of them, yet it was like you were looking for a standing room.
Okay. Yeah. And how long did this conference go on?
It started on the 11th and went through the 15th.
Shall we take this caller?
Sure.
Hello, caller. You're on the air.
Yes. I'm just calling to make a comment.
Okay.
Drugs, crime, and politics. I'm looking at this as an awful thing.
Yes, go ahead.
Because I noticed in city of Houston, there have been arrests made on misdemeanor offenses such as less than an ounce of cocaine and paraphernalia, and these people are coming away with made like felonies. Now, my question is,
Go ahead.
after a person has been charged with a misdemeanor felony, as I see, is it worth it to take a man's freedom of having a job or ability to feed his family?
Okay, that's a very good question. I'm sorry. I thought you were through. I'll have to say I've been asking that same question for about 20 years now.
Wow.
Does merely having a little bit of cocaine or a little bit of marijuana justify destroying a man's family and destroying his future and his ability to hold a job? Now, I felt like you were maybe a little bit unclear about the differences between misdemeanors and felonies here. Misdemeanors are minor crimes that are tried in county courts at law. The maximum penalty for them is a year in the county jail. As far as drugs are concerned, possession of less than an ounce of marijuana is a Class B misdemeanor with up to 6 months. Less than 2 ounces is a Class A misdemeanor for up to a year. Possession of more than that is a felony. Possession of any amount with intent to sell is a felony.
Mm-hmm.
As far as the harder drugs are concerned, usually, and I'm not as clear about the numbers here, but I believe anything over a gram in most cases, mere possession is a felony. And once again, any intent to sell makes it a felony.
Now, I was going to say, if we go to Portugal, Spain, Germany, they supply drugs to people. They have injection centers. Nobody's lives are getting ruined over these drugs.
Just heroin. They don't supply cocaine.
No, but heroin. They don't ruin anybody's lives. They help the people get a legal source. They help them get off of it when they want to get off of it. And they're there to make sure that they don't overdose.
Yeah. Well, and the really amazing thing, and we've all been so scared by the propaganda we've received all of our lives, is that if we look at all of the opioids, from heroin on down to Vicodin, a person can be addicted to one of these and lead a perfectly normal life if they have a regulated legal supply. Doctors tend to joke and say the two bad side effects of a heroin overdose are constipation and withdrawal symptoms if you don't get any. Hello, caller, you're on the air.
I just was wondering what your thoughts on this were. There's a large portion of society that believes that we want to live in a society that doesn't show drugs or this or that. And that's just the way that we feel, and we don't want drugs legal. We don't want injection sites and things like that. I'm just curious: is it too much that there's an error? Is it too much that? Is it too politically correct that people can't just live in communities like that and try and keep that community? It seems like if the drug-minded community comes in, it's there to stay, and then it just grows everywhere.
Okay, thank you. The only drug-free community in all of human history that I have been able to discover have been some of the polar Eskimos who live in climates that make any kind of drugs available. Every other human community in the history of the world, from the earliest traces of man that we find 15 to 20 to 30,000 years ago, we find traces of use of poppies. Everything from at least 3 to 4 to 5,000 years ago, whether we go to Babylon or Egypt or anywhere else, we find the use of beer, alcohol. If we look at non-human animals, there are all kinds of documented cases of animals from robins to elephants that go out of their way to hunt down fermented fruit, which they eat and get drunk, since the fermented fruit, in effect, is wine. It may be one thing to say, wouldn't it be wonderful if there could be a drug-free community, but it hasn't ever happened. And the other side is, from what we've seen to date, law is certainly not the tool to use to make it come about. Hello, caller, you're on the air.
I'm calling back again.
Oh, I'm sorry I cut you off.
My question wasn't answered earlier, I don't think, or maybe you didn't understand. I'm asking is, why or how can a guy or person be charged with a misdemeanor felony, serve his time, or pay whatever restitution there is, and then when he's released, the system has it allocated that that person is unable to get a job, or either, driver's license probably, or either maybe get help from the state or anything like that after he served his time or paid his dues to society. What's the point?
Okay.
That's been a question I've been asking for a long time. I see people come out of jail, they do their time, and this is supposed to be the debt you pay to society. When you get out, you go on paper and you go report in once a month, and they make sure that you're doing everything nice. But yet, you still can't rent an apartment. Every time you go for a job, you say you have a little misdemeanor charge. And I just heard about a guy with AT&T the other day. Small possession of a joint of marijuana, and it's just ruining people's lives forever.
Well, a long time ago in law school, I took a course in Chinese law. And the old Chinese saying, for someone that had been convicted of a crime, was that they had been capped as a felon. As in, put a dunce cap on someone and make them sit in the corner of the schoolroom. The old English stating we use is that someone has been branded as a felon. Now, at that time in China, once a person left prison and took the cap off, they were treated just like anyone else. So the English view that dates back to the Puritans is that once you were branded as a felon, that was something that stayed with you forever. Now, you can get your driver's license back. You can't get a permit to carry a gun. You do get, in the state of Texas and in most places, the right to vote back. The problem is denying people jobs, refusing to rent them apartments. These are the acts of the private individuals. They're not part of the law. If you can't get an apartment, it's not the state of Texas saying you can't. It's the Texas Apartment Owners Association. You want to add anything before we take a break?
No, you covered it very well.
Okay, I think we need to take a break then, and we'll be back in a few minutes.
Opponent of the Department of Justice, along with the FBI, the Marshal Service, the Bureau of Prisons, the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms, and various other divisions of the Department of Justice proper. The biggest difference between DEA and any of those other component agencies of the Department of Justice is that we are a single mission agency, and also that we have the largest overseas presence of any federal law enforcement agency in the government. Domestically, the Houston Field Division, which I represent, is among the 4 largest divisions in the United States. Our agency is an investigative agency, not an interdiction agency, which means that we investigate people that violate the Controlled Substances Act or violate the drug laws. And we don't run around chasing people that are transporting the drugs. That's the interdiction side. Most commonly, Coast Guard, Border Patrol, Customs Service are the interdiction agencies. In my position as the DEA Chief of Intelligence for the Houston Division, I'm part of a team that is the instrument. The team is the instrument that carries out the policies and or laws dictated by our legislature. We in DEA are in the executive branch, and we are akin to soldiers fighting the war in Afghanistan. We're the soldiers in the drug war. I heard that term mentioned, and I'll mention it again for some context. We are the soldiers in the drug war that are executing the policies established by our leadership in Washington, and those policies change depending on administrations, as you have seen throughout history. So I always make this point, to illustrate, if you do not support the war, whether it's in Afghanistan or Iraq or wherever it may be, but you still honor the soldier, then consider the DEA agents as being the same as those soldiers. Overall, in general terms, with regards to our organization, our primary focus is the targets or the drug traffickers that are either cultivating the drug, transporting the drug, or distributing the drugs in the United States. As the Chief of Intelligence for DEA, my job is to serve as the principal advisor to the special agent in charge and other executives and policymakers in Washington. I also manage an operational intelligence program that is the largest in DEA. I have direct authority over all of the intelligence components in the division. We have 14 offices, about 80 people involved in intelligence activities. Half of those are Texas National Guard military folks that are embedded in DEA. And then I have indirect authority from San Diego to Brownsville and inside Mexico for intelligence collection activities of DEA. So that's just to let you know who I am and what I do and some of that background. But I also want to let everyone know that I'm not here to criticize, condemn, or convince you about any one position with regard to the drug issues. I'm here to partake in an educated discussion that may affect policy and in one way or another. And we mentioned the drug war as a rhetorical statement, and from my point of view, being on the pointy end of the stick as one of the soldiers in the drug war, to me it is a drug war. It's a conflict that is marred by death and certainly threats to our national security. A significant number of terrorist organizations partially fund their activities with drug proceeds. Take the FARC, the Fuerzas Armadas Revolucionarias Colombianas. In Colombia, for example, they tax marijuana and coca growers to cultivate their drug crops, and they use those monies to further their activities as a counter-revolutionary organization in Colombia. Based on our intelligence, DEA has conservatively linked 19 of 43 officially designated foreign terrorist organizations to drug trafficking activities at various levels. Our latest activity with regards to the nexus between drugs and terrorism is in Afghanistan. We're growing our presence in Afghanistan. We'll soon have 75 people, agents and intelligence analysts permanently assigned to Afghanistan in 5 offices. You may be familiar with the fact that just 2 weeks ago, 3 DEA agents were killed in Afghanistan in a helicopter crash while operating on a drug-related mission. In the 1980s, marijuana was the biggest problem facing our country, and Colombia was the primary source of supply for that drug. Mexico now serves as the most significant source country for a lot of the drugs that are coming into the United States. As a side note, most of the drugs coming into the United States right now are coming in through the United States-Mexico border. and the number is in the high 90s. And that's marijuana, cocaine, methamphetamine, and heroin. And those are just the drugs that are cultivated or processed or manufactured in Mexico. There's other drugs like cocaine, primarily coming from South America, that come through Mexico on their way into the United States. Given that they're the most significant source country, the cartels are warring for ownership of the corridors that they use to move the drugs into the United States. The number of people dying for the quote-unquote right to bring drugs into the United States is staggering, as the ambassador mentioned. Give you another quick example. In Laredo, I'll call our office in Laredo today and our office on McAllen, which are on the border. In Laredo, as of today, we have, in Laredo alone, 75,000 pounds, that's 37.5 tons of marijuana in our warehouses. This is marijuana that's been seized by Border Patrol, primarily at the Border Patrol checkpoints or along the riverbanks. So in Laredo, we have 37.5 tons of marijuana in our warehouses, and that does not include the other drugs. If you picture a Volkswagen car in volume, size, shape, amount of space, weight, that's about a ton. Okay, so you take 37 Volkswagens and stack them up, put them in a warehouse. That's how much marijuana we have in our warehouse in Laredo right now. In McAllen, just this week, we destroyed another 37.5 tons that was in our warehouses in marijuana, and that marijuana had been seized from August to October of this year. When I was when I first started with DEA in 1979, marijuana was the big deal. The Colombians were a big deal. I was stationed in New Orleans for my first office, and I went from being a police officer, I went from the intelligence community to being a police officer to working for DEA, and quickly learned that the problem at the time was marijuana coming from Colombia. We worked marijuana mothership cases that averaged about 40 tons per shipment. It was staggering, amazing. We had a saying in those days that was so many Colombians, so little time, and I think we could say so much marijuana, so little time, actually. And that brings us to the topic of our discussion tonight: should marijuana be legalized? Some of you received a CD that we handed out. It has DEA's policies on there about the legalization question, whether we should, we shouldn't, and so forth and so on. Remember, we are the instruments of the policy. We don't pass, DEA does not pass the laws. We're not in the legislative branch. We're the executive branch. We're the ones that enforce those laws. So in that CD, we have a lot of information as to what's the government and the political and the medical and the health and all of the various issues that the United States government points to as reasons not to legalize marijuana. In law enforcement, we don't only enforce the laws, we're also known as public safety officials. So the question about marijuana, whether it should or should not be legalized, if we're just going to focus on marijuana for the moment, is a public safety issue. There is a medicinal marijuana that can be ingested as a pill that serves the same purpose that folks are saying they need the marijuana to smoke to help their health issues, whatever they may be, whether it's cancer or some other issue. So I'll yield the floor and let my colleagues make their comments, and then I'll be happy to discuss any issue with regard to drugs as we go along. Thank you, sir.
Clayton, would you set us up a little bit about what we've just seen here? Weren't you at the meeting when?
Yes.
Yes. Okay.
It was a roundtable discussion. There was Ethan Edelman. There was Mr. Hale. A few other people there.
And where and when did this take place?
This was over at the Rice University at the Baker Institute. I believe it would be 2 weeks ago.
Okay.
And brought all these people in to talk about the drug problem. And to me, I don't know, it's just, it really didn't hit on the problems that were there. He was more on a problem of a large scale instead of what we're interested in is the local areas.
Well, of course, I'm interested in the large scale, and I think the problems have to be solved on the large scale. There were some things he said that I think are worth commenting on, and one that really surprised me was that he ended up by totally weaseling out of any comment on the medical marijuana issue. Did that surprise you the way it did me?
Yeah, I mean, he was, even through the talks afterwards,
Yeah.
he was very evasive.
I mean, up until now, everything that we have heard officially from any of the federal agencies has been absolutely no medical marijuana. It has no value at all.
Right.
And here all of a sudden he says, gee, I sympathize with their pain or whatever it is.
But he was just passing it off. He
Yeah,
didn't-
that it's
Well,
not
there was
his
no
job.
sincerity there.
Yeah. I did notice that he was talking about starting out in New Orleans in 1979 when marijuana was the major problem and they were finding motherships with 40 tons on them. I'd like to know what we've gotten for our money in the 30 years since 1979.
I asked him a question,
Yeah.
and it's the question that Dean has always been asking. What have you accomplished with this drug war?
Yeah.
And his comment to me was, if I could say one benefit, we probably have 2 million hardcore crack addicts instead of 5 or 6 million.
Okay. Well, I think he's way, way, way over-exaggerating there. But it seems to me like, 37 tons in the warehouse at Laredo that they picked up from August through October. That's a third of a year. That sounds like
10 tons a month.
160 tons a year or so. It looks to me like they're not doing much to slow it down.
Oh, it's more readily available everywhere.
Yeah.
They haven't done anything on reducing supply at all.
Well, the numbers that have been striking me the most lately, in 1937, when they passed the first federal marijuana law, the head of the Bureau of Narcotics told Congress that to his best estimate, there were less than 100,000 marijuana users in the whole country. The federal government's estimates now, some 70 years later, are that over 40% of all of the adults in the country have used at least once. So it looks to me like it's been a very, very successful law. It's gone from 100,000 users to 100 million users in 70 years' time.
Well, they promoted everything they can to make everybody smoke.
Yeah.
With all their lies.
And the other thing, he talked about terrorists and funding terrorists.
But there's an easy way to stop that is by ending the drug war and having none of these drugs coming in and all this money going out.
Well, what I was going to say is that he's neglecting to point out that the money's there not for the drugs, but for the laws. And that what the terrorists in Mexico are fighting over, or the gangs in Mexico are fighting over, are not drugs. Most of them don't give a damn about drugs. They're fighting over money.
Right.
Now, the last estimate I saw was that the Mexican drug industry was earning over $30 billion a year from the United States. That it's one of the 3 leading economic sectors in Mexico, right up with petroleum production and manufacturing, and that the other 2 are decreasing. Now, we worry about the Taliban. selling opium, heroin, to finance their war in Afghanistan and to finance Al-Qaeda. But the money doesn't come from the drugs. They're cheap. The money comes from the drug laws. Marijuana is a simple agricultural product.
Mm-hmm.
If it were legal, it could be grown, harvested, processed, and sold for no more than it costs to sell broccoli.
True, except
Well,
the people who grow it and manufacture it
Okay.
and manicure it, they couldn't survive on broccoli prices.
Well, we have farmers that survive on broccoli prices. They grow broccoli, or they
Yes,
grow
but-
lettuce.
Yes, but they grow fields and fields and
Okay.
fields of it. And when
And-
they make a penny a head on a head of lettuce,
Well, even so, let's multiply it by 10 times. Even if it costs the same as top grade steaks, that's still no more than about $1 an ounce,
right?
instead of the $200 to $400 an ounce that good quality illegal marijuana brings. Heroin, when it was legal, the Bear Company made both heroin and aspirin and sold them at the same price. Heroin on the streets in America, in a very diluted fashion, now brings over $100,000 an ounce. A kilogram. A kilogram of aspirin retail is about $30. That's 300 times as much. Methamphetamine, which was one of the ones he mentioned, as a manufactured legal drug sold through the pharmacy, and it's prescribed for your kids with ADHD now, is literally hundreds of tablets for $1 wholesale, not $100 an ounce like it brings on the street. Over 90% of that $35 billion a year going to Mexico for drugs pays not for the drugs, it pays for the American drug laws. It also pays to corrupt the American police enforcing those drug laws. If you took that 90% of the money away from the Mexican cartels, first, they'd lose all interest in fighting because there wouldn't be anything they'd get out of it. And second, even if they still wanted to fight, they couldn't afford to buy the military-grade weapons they're using now.
Right.
If you take 90% of the money away from the Taliban, how much can they spend fighting American troops? They won't have anything. The problem with American drug laws is that they don't stop the drugs from coming. They just throw lots of money at a bunch of really bad guys.
Well, we probably spend more money on interdiction, on stopping the drugs, than it would cost to buy all the drugs that they manufacture in Afghanistan a year.
The problem with that is you can't buy it all up because you can grow the drugs anywhere. During the American Civil War, the American South, which was blockaded during the war and couldn't ship anything in or out, grew all of the opium for morphine that their army used for the whole Civil War. In 1872, I saw a report from the Massachusetts State Health Commission complaining about the hundreds of pounds of morphine being shipped into Massachusetts from opium fields in Vermont, of all places, and went ahead complaining about also all of the opium produced in Florida and Louisiana, and said that a farmer with 10 acres in Arizona could grow enough opium poppies to live. Now, basically, I'm not sure there's any place in the world where you can't grow marijuana. At one time before the Second World War, there was more cocaine grown in Indonesia than there was in South America. It was grown for a while in India and Sri Lanka, but the British cut it out because it caused too many problems to administer, and they were doing better selling tea. So, no, you can't just buy it all up, because if you start buying it all up, people will just grow more. One estimate has that we're right now growing opium or poppies on under 40% of the number of acres that were used to grow poppies in the year 1900.
40% less.
Yeah. No, just 40% of the amount, less than half. So, you know, the problem with his war on drugs and being the warrior, I keep thinking it's a whole lot like the story of the man that the only tool he had was a hammer, that he sees every problem as a nail. And we've been pounding on this drug war nail for too long. Let's take another break, shall we?
Sure.
Very much. Thank you, Ambassador Bill, for organizing this. I should say, I remember I was here 7 years ago for an event on drug policy that Bill Martin set up, and I remember sitting at lunch with the ambassador, and before I got involved in the issue of drug policy, I was involved in the issue of Middle East politics and U.S. foreign policy. I published my first academic articles in that area. I remember sitting with you talking about, and the ambassador was the ambassador to Israel and Syria, and talking about that. And I remember thinking what a joke it was. I went from sort of one hopeless area to another hopeless area. And quite frankly, I actually still think the Middle East looks hopeless. Maybe I'll turn around. But drug reform, actually, there is hope finally at last for real change. So I'll talk about that for a few minutes. But let me start off by saying this, that I personally regard the war on drugs as essentially a fundamental evil in our society and in global society. I think the notion of taking certain psychoactive substances, certain plants and chemicals, and treating those as criminal, and treating anybody who touches them, uses them, consumes them, sells them, buys them, grows them, whatever, as criminal is basically wrong. It's wrong. And especially for people whose only offense is to take those things into their body. I think that policy, which evolved over the last 100 years or so around the world, with the U.S. government as the principal proselytizer and enforcer of a global drug prohibition regime, has generated immense harm, immense death and suffering and crime and organized crime and violence all around the world. When I hear Gary laying out how many terrorist organizations are making their money from drugs and how much has been seized, this and that, I just listen to that and I say, that's the evidence what I'm talking about. We're talking about a global black market in drugs worth $200 to $300 billion a year that is the most extraordinary reservoir of revenue for organized and unorganized criminals, for political terrorists and criminal organizations of every political stripe. So this war on drugs, this prohibitionist policy, I believe, has generated enormous harm all around the world. Now, I want to focus first on the United States. You know, part of what motivates me is my shame as a proud American in living in a country which possesses less than 5% of the world's population, but almost 25% of the world's incarcerated population. We rank first in the world in the per capita incarceration of our fellow citizens. We lock up people at 2, 5, 8, 10 times the rate of most other countries around the world. The Russians are in second place. Keep huffing and puffing and catch up. They can't do it. We are number one when it comes to locking up our fellow citizens. When it comes to parole and probation, it's not just the 2.25 million people behind bars, for various offenses in federal and state prisons and local jails. It's also another 5 million plus under parole and probation. There, too, I believe that we lead the world in this. Now, what's driving this more than anything else, to some very good extent, is the war on drugs. We've increased the number of people locked up for a drug law violation from roughly 50,000 in 1980 to about 500,000 people today. And that doesn't count the unknown hundreds of thousands of others who are locked up for other parole and probation violations involving a dirty urine because they're in some diversion program. It doesn't count the people who commit acts of prostitution or petty theft to support their habits because their habits are more expensive because they're illegal. It doesn't count the people getting involved in violence among drug dealers, because when a drug dealer has a fight, you don't have the option of saying, I'm going to take you to court. right? I mean, all of this stems from a failed prohibitionist policy. It's probably safe to say that a third of all the people behind bars tonight are there in one way or another because of a drug prohibition-related violation. Now, in terms of who's locked up, I think most of us know it is overwhelmingly and disproportionately young people, especially young men of color. Right? I mean, at extraordinary numbers. The numbers of people being locked up, you know, in America of close to, I think, half or 40% of the population being African American, young African Americans having a better chance of going to jail or prison and getting a higher education. I mean, this too is an element that I think is fundamentally immoral. Now, if you ask about the origins of this stuff, and if you ask the question, why is it? Why is it that we treat alcohol and cigarettes as legal and these other drugs, marijuana, cocaine, heroin, hallucinogens, whatever, as illegal? I mean, one might think that someplace in our history, some early version of the National Academy of Science, the Institute of Medicine got together and they held us, looked at all the evidence, they concluded that alcohol and cigarettes were somehow less dangerous than marijuana, cocaine, and the opiates, heroin, what have you. I mean, I don't know if anybody believes that somehow this is how it happened, that this is how we got the first drug laws. In fact, when you read the transcripts of Congress in 1914 criminalizing the opiates, when you read the transcripts of state legislatures criminalizing marijuana and other drugs, it reads a lot more like a Monty Python routine than it does like any type of independent scientific analysis. If you ask, why then? Why these drugs and not those drugs? Well, the number one answer, there are many answers, but the number one answer had to do with who used those drugs and who was perceived to use those drugs. So long as the principal consumers of opiate drugs in America in the 1870s and 80s were middle-aged white women dealing with menopause, and when there was no aspirin or Motrin or anything like that around, nobody thought to criminalize those drugs. Nobody wanted to put grandma or their aunt behind bars. But when the Chinese start coming over, working on the railroads, working in the mines, you know, going back at the end of a long, hard day's work, smoking up that opium pipe just like they did in the old country, just like many other people would have a drink at the end of the day, that's when you saw the first drug prohibition laws in Nevada and California directed at Chinese minorities with all the fears about what would the Chinamen do luring our white women into their opium dens and seducing and addicting them. The first anti-cocaine laws were in the South, in Louisiana, in the first part of the century, directed at black men, at Negroes, who's afraid would take this white powder up their black noses and lose sight of their proper place in society. The first anti-marijuana laws were in the teens and the 20s, in the Midwest and the Southwest, El Paso, Texas, for example, and Utah, right? Directed at Mexican Americans, Mexican migrants, coming up here, taking good jobs from the good white people, going back home, smoking up a little of that funny-smelling reefer cigarette, and who knows what they would do to our children and to our precious white women. It's always been, to some very good extent, about who uses those drugs and who is perceived to do so. And that, I'm not going to say the war on drugs today is racist. I don't think it is racist. But it is racially disproportionate in its impact. Its origins are, in fact, rooted in racism. It is not a legitimate basis for continuing a public policy. Now, there's the other negative consequences. You know, the millions of people who have died of HIV/AIDS or are living with HIV/AIDS related not because drugs causes AIDS, not because needles cause AIDS, but because when you share a dirty syringe, a syringe that's been infected with somebody else, that's how you spread this virus. In other countries, including Margaret Thatcher's England of 1985, right off the bat, they say we need harm reduction policies. We need to make sterile syringes available to people who cannot or will not stop injecting drugs today. And they kept their HIV rates low in the Netherlands, Australia, the UK. But here in the United States, especially in the East Coast, where we failed to do this, sometimes throughout the 80s into the 90s, and quite frankly in the state of Texas right till today. I mean, right till today, you still do not have a legal needle exchange program in this state, essentially consigning hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people to be needlessly infected, and not just them, but their children, their babies, and people who come into contact with them. Take a country like Iran. Iran has the highest heroin addiction rate in the world right now. 5 years ago, the Ayatollah, who was the Minister of Justice, issued a fatwa declaring that needle exchange programs and methadone maintenance programs are now okay under Sharia law. Makes you wish that our own mullahs in America, not the Muslim mullahs, but the others, could come to the same level of sanity in dealing with this public health crisis. We have alternatives. When it comes to marijuana, I basically think take it out of the criminal justice system. Just take it out. Of the 1.8 million drug arrests last year, 800,000 alone were for marijuana possession, typically of small amounts. I think the risks of making marijuana legal in terms of increased levels of use and abuse are modest. But the benefits in terms of no longer giving a criminal record to millions and millions of Americans, in terms of no longer locking up people and arresting people for this, the prisons aren't filled with marijuana law violators. But those arrests, those pernicious arrests over and over and over again, people are not doing harm to anybody else, right? Ending marijuana prohibition would be a huge step forward in injecting a level of sanity into our drug policy debates. Is marijuana a drug? You're damn right it is. Can you get addicted to marijuana? You're damn right you can get addicted to marijuana. But that said, nobody's ever died of a marijuana overdose. The likelihood of getting addicted to marijuana is less than with most other drugs. The consequences of that addiction are less serious than with other drugs, and the ability to put that addiction behind you is oftentimes easier than with respect to other drugs. It does not have the association with violence and reckless sexual behavior that alcohol or other drugs do. So marijuana now, the latest Gallup poll showing that 44% of Americans are now saying make marijuana legal, that over 50% of Democrats and over 50% of people out west and over 50% of people under the age of 50 all say let's do it. I think it's time. It's time. We may well see a ballot initiative in California next year to make marijuana legal. I don't know if it's yet ripe to win. I should say, however, that the principal proponent of that initiative, Richard Lee, his parents, Richard and Ann Lee, are sitting right here in the front row, and they're from Houston, Texas, which is where the proponent of this initiative grew up before he moved to California. We need... When Senator Webb or when Presidents Cardoso, Gaviria, and Zedillo say, let's open up this debate, it's time to open up this debate. I've simply met too many people at the highest levels of the U.S. government over the years who, when you ask them, why is there any sort of really independent strategic thinking about how to deal with the problems in Mexico or Afghanistan or Colombia, never mind the legalization issue, just thinking strategically with all options on the table, you know what they say? No. We can't have that debate. Why we're afraid? Because God forbid we write a memo, a creative memo about this stuff, and it gets exposed. Next thing you know, we lose our job. That element of censorship and of self-censorship, of open dialogue about drug policy alternatives, that's what needs to come to an end. My hope is that with the Obama administration, we will begin to see that stuff land up on the table. Things are moving in the right direction. It's not just the growing support for ending marijuana prohibition. It's what's happening in Congress with the support for legalizing needle exchange programs. It's what's happening with rolling back the harsh and racially discriminatory crack powder penalties. There is an opening happening right now. So, Ambassador, I wish you luck with the Middle East. I don't miss it. But I tell you, when it comes to ending the war on drugs, I think the wind at last is at our backs and no longer in our face. Thank you very much.
Okay. That also came from the Baker Conference you
Yes.
had. Is that correct?
Yes, it was.
Any other comments about
You know,
Dr. Edelman? Yeah.
basically, people are saying that the drug war's done.
Yeah.
It's the resources that the DEA just doesn't have enough to cover everything that's happening in our country.
Well, I was thinking about something else too, and there's been a lot of talk over the past 2 or 3 years about the Bush's administration committing, $2.5 billion to aid Mexico in fighting the drug trafficking problem, and trying to balance that against the $30 billion a year that we provide to the drug cartels. Mm-hmm. It's just not much of a balance.
No.
And I think we have to be honest in saying that Edelman is just as much of a long-time career professional on his side of the argument as the DEA agent was on his side. He's executive of the Drug Policy Foundation and has been for several years. So he's a professional spokesman, just like the other guy was. Mm-hmm. But
he was a professor for Princeton before.
Yeah, and was a student of one of the real greats, who was one of the first to really study heroin addicts during the late 30s and 1940s, and Edelman is one of his students. So, I think really that big changes are underway, and
Yes.
I stumped my toe badly about 10 years ago, 15 years ago, when I, speaking from the enthusiasm of ignorance, said I thought that marijuana would be legal in 5 years. Didn't happen. But right now, as Edelman said, he's enthusiastic. He thinks the wind's at our back. I'm going to be foolish again and stick my neck way out on the line and say, I think something strong on marijuana policy is going to happen on the federal level before the end of 2010. Now,
Before the end of next year.
yeah, I may be as wrong this time as I was last time.
I feel exactly the same way, and we were talking earlier, I just think it's going to be, they're going to change the rescheduling of marijuana.
Yeah. Well, one of the things that I think a lot of people are starting to catch on to is Edelman talked a lot about prison population, and we mentioned a couple of things about the DEA's policy, the number of people in jail. If you look at the number of states that are in severe budgetary crunches at this time, they can't afford the luxury of these gigantic prison populations. And one of the great ways states could save money right now is by simply depenitentiaryizing, if not decriminalizing, drug possession and even drug use. I think we're going to see something happen. You want to get your last comment here before we run out of time?
I think you're pretty much correct. I see things moving at a very fast pace. I think that by the end of next year we'll have the change in our scheduling or whatever they're going to do.
Well, one of the things, I subscribe to an internet news clipping service that gives me a very good selection of news stories from around the world on drug issues. And it has really amazed me over about the last 18 months or so how dramatically editorial page comments, letters to the editor, and op-ed pieces have done an almost about-face. And it's now very much in favor of reforming drug policy. Speaking of which, this might be a good time to write a letter to your county judge and to the Houston Chronicle and say how much you like what our district attorney has done on these minor possession cases. And remember that it's your government, but it's your government only if you make it work for you. So not only call and write us to help us see where you want the show to go, but more important, get in touch with your elected representatives, because that's the only way that your employees in Houston, in Austin, or in Washington can know where you want the country to go as well. It's your country if you take control. Thank you.
We have these private prisons that have now hired lobbyists to go get minimum mandatories.
I began to understand that the 17 or the 19-year-old kid I had in the backseat of my police car was not a criminal at all.
Remove the profit motive. If you remove the profit motive, you can do away with almost all these problems. And how do you do that? Simple. The end prohibition, which can only mean one thing. Legalize drugs. Legalize all drugs.
If we really want to improve our urban neighborhoods, the most important thing that we could do, the single most important thing that we could do, is end the war on drugs.